On the phone, we have a gentleman who coached the St. Louis Cardinals back in the 60s. Elliott kind of remembers that. Elliott's a little older than me. He grew up in St. Louis. He
Hmm.
also he also coached in one of the greatest games in NFL history. He was an assistant coach during that 58 championship game.
Yes.
Charley Winner, how you doing, Mr. Winner?
Fine, thank you.
I was reading your bio here. It said that you were a pilot in World War II.
I was a radio operator and a gunner on B-17 in World War II, and then we were shot down over Germany on our 17th mission.
And I see you were a prisoner of war for 6 weeks in a German camp.
Yes, I was in a German prison camp, and as small as I am, I lost 15 pounds in the period of time I was in there. But I was very happy that I was in a German prison camp rather than a Japanese prison camp.
Why was that?
Well, the Japanese were very brutal to the American prisoners. And at the time I was captured, I think the Germans felt that they were on the run, and they did not mistreat us. They just didn't give us much food. We got a seventh of a loaf of that heavy, dark German bread a day, and some dehydrated soup that looked like hay that never did fill out when you soaked it in water. And after we were liberated, there was a warehouse outside of the prison camp that was packed to the ceiling with Red Cross food parcels that they neglected to hand out to us. But other than that, the Germans didn't mistreat us like the Japanese mistreated a lot of the prisoners.
What did you do after you were released?
After I was released in the service you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we were given orders to stay there at the prison camp because there was an Air Force base, a German Air Force base a few miles away, and they were going to come in and fly us out. So the Russians were a bunch of young guys. They were upset that we didn't tear the fences down. They said, "You act like you're still prisoners. If you don't get out there and tear down these fences, we're going to come through here with tanks." And so we tore down the fences, although it wasn't necessary. And we had the run of the countryside, and we had the Red Cross food parcels, and we went over to this little fishing village of Barth. We were in a prison camp called Stalag Luft 1, and it was Barth on the Baltic Sea. And we went over to this fishing village, and we traded some cigarettes for some German wine, and I was a young guy and wasn't used to drinking or anything, so I had a couple swigs of wine, and so we went down to the bay and took one of those German fishing boats where guys are rowing on each side. So I was with the smallest, so they said, "You steer the boat and we'll row," and I had them going in circles. They said if I didn't straighten out the boat, they're going to throw me in. So that was pretty exciting. But it was long enough in the prison camp. It didn't do me any harm, but I learned to appreciate what I had.
What made you decide that you wanted to play football in college?
Well, I came from a small town in New Jersey, Somerville, and I didn't know much about football, except we played in the sandlots a lot. And from the first time I went to practice in high school as a freshman, I was impressed with football and the coaches who we had handling it. And at that time, I made up my mind, well, I'd sure like to be a football coach. Never thinking I was going to get to college because my family didn't have the finances. But that's the only thing I've ever wanted to do. I didn't want to be a doctor or a lawyer or anything like that. And God led me in the right direction, and I got a chance to go to college and eventually get into pro football.
Now, you went to college at Washington University in St. Louis.
Yes.
All my family went to Washington U.
Oh my God, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah, except for me. You had to be smart to get into Washington U. So I ended up at the University of Missouri.
Well, that's not bad. Both of my daughters graduated from the University of Missouri.
but not too many of the people that go to WashU want to become football coaches.
Yeah.
I'd have to say you're probably the only guy who went to Washington University who became an NFL coach.
Yeah, I don't recall of any others. I remember I went out to Washington University, and I didn't know I was going to get in or not, and first thing I know, I was in. I guess it's because I was a veteran.
How did you end up picking Washington University?
Well, I started college at Southeast Missouri State College in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, which is south of St. Louis. And we played Washington University in St. Louis, and freshmen were allowed to play, although I didn't get to play a whole lot. But I was impressed with the school and the academic structure, and so I thought, well, I'm going to give it a chance. I have nothing to lose. And Washington had dropped football during World War II and hadn't started it up yet. So, and they said they were going to start it that season. So I went out there. First thing I knew, I was in there, and they did not start it up that next season. I only got to play two seasons, my junior year and my senior year. But I was impressed with the school, and so went out there and had to work my tail off. I was about ready to quit school because I didn't have enough money even with the GI Bill. So I got a job in the school soda fountain, and from then on I had it made because I'd get up and eat ice cream for breakfast, which I'm still eating. And I'm getting some of my seatbelts in the car. I'm having trouble with them.
So when you played at Washington University, Weeb Eubank was the coach. What was Weeb like as a coach at Washington?
Well, Weeb had just arrived at Washington University. He was the head basketball coach at Brown and assistant football coach at Brown. Rip Eagle was the head coach. He worked under him, and of course Rip Eagle went to Penn State later on. Weeb was an energetic young guy and didn't leave anything to chance. He knew what he had. We had a lot of veterans on the football team, but he knew that we just didn't have big time caliber players. But he worked around it, and he taught us to work and study hard, and it turned out that one of the first things he said to us, he had just married his oldest daughter to a halfback at Brown University, and he was kidding, and he said, "Now I don't want any of you halfbacks dating my other two daughters, and I'm a veteran sitting in the back of the room, and I'm figuring, what the heck would I want with one of his daughters anyhow?" So then I saw one of them, and I ran into her up on the campus, and I said, she looked like a young girl. I said, "Hey, kid, how old are you?" And she told me. I said, "Hey, you want to go have some ice cream?" So we went and had ice cream.
So the ice cream sealed the deal?
I think it helped because we're still eating ice cream. 65 years later, we're still eating it.
Wow. So did Washington U play at Francis Field then? Or was it noted?
Yeah, and they're still playing there.
Because I remember sneaking through the metal fence there to watch a couple games when I was a teenager. Don't tell anybody, but
yeah. Well, I'm anxious to go back there. I'm being taken into the Washington University Sports Hall of Fame in February, and I'm anxious to go back because there was one bar in the fence not too far from the entrance to the office that you could slide up and down and get in the stadium, and I'm anxious to see if it's still there.
Yeah, I think they probably changed it after all these years, but I can remember one of the highlights of being a kid was on a Saturday afternoon.
Yes.
Either ride your bicycle or walk over to Washington U and slip through the fence.
I'll tell you, Washington is a good school, and it has a great campus, and we always had like St. Louis, and so we went back, and I was there for 5 years coaching the Cardinals.
So what took them so long to put you in their Hall of Fame?
I don't know. I don't know how those things work.
Maybe they did it alphabetically.
That's possible. But I'm very happy with it, even though it did take all these years. I'm glad it's happening before I pass away.
So what did Weeb Eubank think when he found out that you were dating his daughter?
He didn't say anything, except they graded the films just like they do in pro football, and I had pretty good grades. And once I started dating Nancy, my grades went down a little bit. And then when I would date Nancy and I'd go over to their house, when he thought it was time for me to go home, he'd sit down on the couch and take off his shoes and socks. He wouldn't say anything, but I knew it was time to go.
Not too subtle, but it worked.
Yeah, it worked. You didn't have to hit me in the head with a hammer.
So when he became a coach with the Browns, did he want you to take the job at Case Tech so you could also help him out scouting with the Browns?
I stayed at Washington University and coached freshman football and got my master's degree after we've left. And I got a job I had a job at Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland as the backfield coach. Lou Saban, who was the captain of the Browns and a great linebacker at the time, was the head coach, and he had just gotten a job. And so on Paul Brown's recommendation, I got the job as the assistant coach there, and I was there for 4 years. And I did do scouting for the Browns, and I worked on a telephone on Sundays up in the press box with Blanton Collier, where I learned an awful lot of football.
I will assume when Weeb asked you to go with him to Baltimore, that was a pretty easy decision?
Oh, yeah. There was no decision at all. I mean, I'd been to the Browns training camp. I'd go watch them practice and all that, and I knew the system. When he went to Baltimore, he used the same system that we used at Washington University, which was a variation of the Cleveland Brown system. And so I knew what he wanted me to do, and it worked out. And I'll tell you, I think a lot of the players coached me rather than me coaching them. Don Shula was one of the players at that time, Gino Marchetti, Art Donovan, Raymond Barry, and I think I learned a lot from those guys. The first time I saw Raymond Barry on the campus, I said, "Hi, Ray. Congratulations on being with us. Happy to see you." And he looked at me and he said, "My name is Raymond." So from then on, everybody called him Raymond. But I learned a lot from those guys.
Did you have any interaction? Did you have any interaction with Paul Brown when you were with the Browns?
Yeah. You see, Nancy grew up with the Brown family. We coached at Great Lakes Naval Training Station during World War II, and Paul Brown was the head coach. We coached basketball and football up there at the time, and so Nancy kind of grew up with the Brown family, and like Mike Brown, who runs the Cincinnati Bengals now, she babysat for him when he was a little boy. So I got to know Paul pretty well.
What was he like?
He was one step ahead of you all the time. Yeah, I'd be up in the press box on game day with Blanton Collier, who had a great football mind, and Blanton would be telling him about different plays to call and so forth. Paul called all the plays by sending the guards in, and all of a sudden Blanton would get upset. He said, "No, we're not doing that." But Paul's deviating. A couple plays later, they'd get a touchdown, and Blanton would say, "Now I see what he was doing." I mean, he had a great football mind, and he could see. A lot of us after a game, the newspaper will talk to us about the game and will say, "Well, I really will have to see the film to know what happened." Paul knew what was happening.
What was he like away from the football field?
He was a very nice guy, liked to have a lot of fun, always joking around, and serious, but he was a real gentleman, and really, the Brown family, the whole family was great.
When we became the head coach of the Colts, did we think he was ready for that?
Yeah, he did. He'd been with the Browns for quite a while. We've had a successful career in high school, and then in college, and then in pro football. So he thought he was ready. Reed was a running back and quarterback by nature, but Brown had him coaching the offensive line, where he learned a tremendous amount of football, and he felt he was ready, and he was happy to take the opportunity.
Because they were a fresh team. They had just started like the year before.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, he felt he was ready. Most of us that are in coaching, strive to be a head coach, and you want to move on. I mean, if you have a coach that's content to be an assistant coach there, you better look for somebody else.
Oh, and in coaching the Colts, it didn't hurt that Weeb had a quarterback by the name of John Unitas.
That's right. But our first quarterback was George Inc. from Arizona, and we got John Unitas because Pittsburgh had drafted him. And Frank Camp, who was the coach of Louisville at the time, called Weeb and said, "Hey, there's a guy at Pittsburgh let loose. You want to try to get him if you can." So we always had a tryout in the spring at Baltimore, because you get a lot of letters from guys who think they can play, and you filter them out and bring them in for a tryout on a Saturday, and you time them in the 40 and different drills and so forth. Well, Unitas came. We invited him to that camp, and he stood out right away. The way he could throw the football and so forth. So we signed him, and that first year, George Shaw was our number one draft choice, a quarterback from Oregon, who was a pretty good quarterback, and he could run, and very intelligent quarterback. And we were doing fairly well, and George Shaw injured his knee, had to have an operation. So John Unitas was sent in right away, never came out. He was the number one quarterback from here on, and there was no questions about it.
Raymond Berry told us that Johnny Unitas and him used to practice before practice and after, just throwing and catching the ball, and that's what made him so good. And then when when Lenny Moore came in, they brought Lenny in and said, here's how you can become a better player, and basically brought him into their whole little practice regimen.
Yeah, that's right. Raymond and John would stay on the field for the longest time after. And Gino Marchetti used to say, wouldn't it be awful to have a whole team of Raymond Berrys? In order to punish the team, the coach would have to say, come on, we're going in early tonight. They just stayed out there and to try to work things out. And I can remember one time we had a 4th and 1 situation, and we didn't have real good field position, but we decided to go for it. He gave the signal to John, and we had a certain running play designed for that situation. And Unitas calls a quick out, and boy, we had our hearts were in our throats, and he completed it for a first down. Unitas was a good thinker. He was a good thinker. He and Raymond went over the films, and Raymond had good moves. And, most receivers have a counter move for their favorite move. He had a counter for his counter. He was always working.
And he ran such precise routes. It always amazed me.
Always did. He was, and he had tremendous hands. Boy, he had strong hands.
Yeah.
And he wasn't the biggest guy in the world. And he had glasses. He wore glasses. He couldn't, his eyes weren't that great. And he carried his bath scales with him on trips so he could weigh himself every day.
Art Donovan did that too. Didn't he carry a scale too to weigh himself every day?
Every day.
Art Donovan, wasn't he concerned about his weight?
Yeah, who?
Art Donovan. Donovan wasn't concerned about his weight at all.
When we went there, Donovan was over 300 pounds, and he couldn't stay down in a stance longer than a couple seconds. You had to go you couldn't go on a quick count on a long count with Donovan. But we put in his contract that he had to report to camp at 265. And he's a big beer drinker and bologna eater. And, was he upset about it. But he became a all-pro, and he appreciated it later on.
He was the polar opposite of Unitas and Raymond Berry with practice habits and training, it seems like.
He would come out on the field before a game, and he would kind of stroll down to the goalpost, and then he would shake one leg and shake the other leg, and then shake his arms, and he said, "Okay, I'm ready." And as they say, if you went on a long count, he'd have to get a breath. So he had a great sense of humor, and he was probably one of the slowest guys we ever had. But he was one of the quickest guys from wall to wall. We used to play a lot of racquetball at that time, and he was excellent in racquetball because he was so quick.
I would figure he just took up a lot of space on the court and didn't have to move.
No, he was quick. He was quick.
So what was your role? Were you more with the offense or the defense?
When I went with Baltimore, the structure of coaching was different in those days. I was the offensive end coach and the defensive end coach. So I coached Raymond Berry and Colt Dion and the receivers, and I coached Gino Marchetti and Don Joyce, who was on our defense.
What was Marchetti like?
Marchetti was like a cat, like a panther. He was quick. He had good football intelligence. They have a football play. They've had it for years called the sucker play, and it's when you pull a guard. You pull a guard, and usually the defensive lineman over that guard will follow down the line for him, and then you give the ball carrier and he goes in that hole, and it's usually pretty successful because they flow with the pulling guards. But Gino was a defensive end. He was one position removed from that, and he would always slide in and get the play. And I said, Gino, how do you know when it's going to be a sucker play? And he said, it's the only play where the tackle turns out on me and the guard pulls away from me. So he said, when that happens, I just slide in. Good. That's what I mean. You learn from the players. There are a lot of natural things that they pick up themselves.
That 58 championship game, no one understood the significance of it until years after. What was that game like?
Well, it was a tough, darn game. I'll tell you, it was cold as hell up there in New York. And Gino broke his leg in that game, and he didn't play in the sudden death part. But he made him bring him back out on the sideline and watched it. And it was, we had the game under pretty much control, and then we lost the ball going in on a touchdown early in the second half, and then from here on, the Giants got momentum, and boy, we were on the ropes. Well, as a matter of fact, we were behind, and we just had seconds left. I don't remember how many, but we had practiced that situation. That's another thing. We was always well prepared. We had practiced a situation where time was running out. We had to get the field goal team in, and we knew about how much time it took. So we worked the ball as far as we could, and then we sent the field goal team in, and Steve Myra, I think it was from South Dakota, kicked the field goal. That was the beginning. And a lot of people turned their television sets off because they didn't know it was a sudden death period.
The referees didn't know either. I think Burt Bell made the call.
Yeah. I don't know, but boy, it was exciting, and I think that led really to the growth of professional football. I mean, because people tell me even today they don't like professional football because it's not as exciting as college football. I watch college football and I love it, and I do think it's exciting, and it's a fantastic game. But if you get involved in a pro football game, it's just as exciting. And the players are more skilled because they're the same skilled players that they were in college, but they have the experience now.
Well, and it's generally the most skilled players that make it to the NFL.
That's right. People will ask me, well, what do you think of this guy on such and such a team in the pros? And I say, listen, if they're on a team, they're exceptional players, so they wouldn't be there.
Frank Gifford to this day blames the referees for those 2 bad spots where he didn't get first downs. Yeah. And Marchetti goes, no, they did analytics of it, and look, and he was short.
Yeah, he was. A guy named Bowden, he's related to Bobby Bowden, that was at Florida State, has written several books. And he came down and interviewed me because he wrote a book about the greatest game. And he went over the films of that game with the Philadelphia Eagle coach who's now in Kansas City and looked at the films. And then I looked at it with him, and there's no question that ball was short. And I don't blame Gifford for complaining about it. He did fumble 3 times that game.
How difficult was it for the players to lift up Weeb and carry him off?
They carried him off the field several different times, and one time they got a hold of his leg, and his leg was in an awkward position, and it dislocated his hip. He had to have a hip operation for being carried off the field. He said, no more carrying me off the field. Of course, and Weeb wasn't as heavy at that time than he became in later years.
Okay.
As long as I've known Weeb, he's always going to go on a diet with somebody.
How hard was it to stay when Weeb was fired as coach under Don Shula? Did you feel like you were basically stabbing Weeb in the back?
Yeah. It was a strange feeling because we were all worried about our jobs. And Weeb was coaching the Senior Bowl at that time in Mobile, Alabama. And Weeb had the job of coaching the Senior Bowl for several years, so he could only take 2 assistant coaches at that time. And that year was not my turn to go. We only had 4 assistant coaches, so 2 would go one year and 2 would go the other year. So I was in Los Angeles. They always sent the coaches to the NCAA meeting, college coaches meeting. You talk to the coaches to get information on players. And so Don McCafferty and I had to go to cover the coaches meeting. So I'm worried about the game, and so I called Weeb, and I said, Weeb, should I be out here doing the coach business, or should I be looking for a job? He said, I just talked to Carl Rosenboom, and he says, we're okay. The next day, it was in the paper, we were fired. So you never know what's going to happen. So, and then Shula kept McCafferty and John Sandusky, and he told me he wasn't going to keep me. And so, I was worried. I started looking around. But then he made Joe Campanella and Gino Marchetti and Bill Pellington player coaches. And they talked to Shula and said, listen, Charlie's the only guy who knows all our defenses and stuff like that. So Shula called me back. He called me up to the hotel one night. He and his wife were up there and said, I've decided to keep you on my staff. And see, I knew Shula when he was, when I first went to Case Tech in Cleveland. Shula was a senior playing on John Carroll University across town, rival. And so I knew Shula and Carl Tassif at that time. So I went back a long time with him.
Yeah. Yeah, Shula was, a defensive back?
He was a defensive back, right.
And a lot of people don't know he was roommates with Art Donovan when they were teammates with the Colts. They had a house together.
Yeah, they did. Matter of fact, when Nancy and I went to Cleveland, Shula had a bed for sale. He sold his bed, and we bought his bed for one of our extra bedrooms.
Art Donovan told us before he passed away that him and Don Shula used to wrestle on the floor at the house.
I would be a bit surprised. I don't think Shula would have much of a chance because Donovan was a roly-poly guy. He'd be hard to get his arm around, get your arms around him. He was a great storyteller, but half of the stories he made up. And, his father was Art Donovan, the famous boxing official.
Right.
I remember when I was a kid, used to listen to the championship fights on radio, and they would say, and officiating is Arthur Donovan. I remember that.
Right.
And he used to come to our training camp every now and then, and he was a good storyteller.
Art Donovan's dad didn't have to break up any fights at training camp, did he?
No, I can't remember. I can't remember ever having a fight, the players. Any place I've been, I can't remember any fights in training camp. Always a lot of hard work, sweat, and humor. One example of the humor is Jim Parker had an off-season job of selling cemetery lots. And at training camp, he was trying to sell Big Daddy Lipscomb a couple of lots, and Big Daddy resisted him. But one time we were out there for the afternoon practice, and it was hot, and they're all laying on the ground doing calisthenics and so forth. And Big Daddy said, "Hey, Jim, I'll take 2 of those lots, but they got to be in the shade."
Big Daddy was a pretty good football player.
Oh, Big Daddy, he could run. I was still fairly fast in those days, and so Big Daddy challenged me to a race across the field, and I wouldn't have run with him unless I thought I could beat him. And that son of a gun beat me. Okay, he could run. We had a defense once where the defensive tackle would drop out, and he had to cover, if there was a close flare, he had to cover the close flare. And Paul Horning came out on a close flare and went for about 40 yards down into the end zone, and Big Daddy was step for step with him and reached up and knocked the ball down. So Big Daddy was a heck of a basketball player. He could do all the globetrotter tricks. All the teams in the off-season had a basketball team and barnstormed to make some extra money. And Big Daddy was a very fine basketball player.
Was it tough on Coach Shula when he took over the Colts, being that he was so young?
No. You see, I think one reason that Rosenblum hired Shula was because he was one of the players, and there were a lot of them there, and there was there was some shenanigans going on, and so Shula was hired, and there wasn't any rumblings because Marchetti and Pellington and Campanella became player coaches. And so things were pretty well controlled. We didn't have any problem. And Schuler's a very smart guy and a good coach, and he knows his football. And a coach doesn't have any trouble with players as long as you know what you're talking about. You can't BS a pro, though.
How did the job with the St. Louis Cardinals come about?
I don't know how it came about, but all of a sudden I was called by Stormy Bidwell. The Cardinals were owned by Stormy and Bill Bidwell, both adopted by the Bidwell family.
Right.
And they never got along real well. So Stormy called me in, excuse me, for an interview, and I didn't even see Bill. And Stormy took me around and asked me the usual questions and so forth. So about a week later, Bill calls me in for an interview. And Bill took me up to his apartment and he had some little kids, and I got along real well with the young kids because I like young kids. Bill later told me, because the two of them didn't converse about anything, he said, you got the job because when we were sending our notes back and forth, your name appeared the most. But I don't know how they first, decided to interview me.
But it worked out. How did what was the transition going from Baltimore to St. Louis for you?
Well, I was in pro football a good number of years, and had a lot of good players, and I felt that I was ready for a job. A lot of guys that came along with me already had gotten jobs, and I didn't. And I thought I was ready, and I was very happy to get the job. And I liked St. Louis, and I told you both of my daughters married St. Louis boys.
And you came to a team that had some players on it. They weren't winning any championships, but
no, we had some pretty good players, and that's one reason the job was attractive. And we started out doing pretty well my first year, and we were leading the league. And then Charlie Johnson, my quarterback, got hurt for the rest of the season. And we didn't have a backup quarterback.
But you did have a rookie on the bench by the name of Jim Hart.
Yeah, Jim Hart was from Southern University, Southern Illinois University, and he was on the bench and hadn't had any playing experience. And I didn't play him in the last couple of games because I didn't think he was ready. But Jim Hart developed into a pretty darn good quarterback. And I still see Jim. He lives south of us in Naples, and every now and then he'll come up and we'll have lunch together. But Jim became a pretty good quarterback. But after I was fired, they hired some guy from the Minnesota staff, and he didn't play hard. Some of the good players he didn't play, and that was the problem.
Yeah.
And you had a pretty good safety in Larry Wilson.
Larry Wilson was the kind of ball player you look for in the draft. A successful pro football player is one that is self-motivated. If you have a guy that you got to build a fire under him each week, you're eventually not going to win. And that's what Lombardi meant when he said he's not our kind of people, or he is our. Lombardi looked for people that were self-starters, self-motivated players, and that's a big part of the game. If you have players that, like Larry Wilson, he was a self-motivated player, and he was always ready to do the job. And he was, as I recall, we put in a safety blitz, and he was the first safety to blitz.
Yeah, and it seemed like every time that he blitzed, he got the quarterback or the running back.
Yeah, that's right. He was a good football player. He played one game. He had two casts on, one cast on each hand, and he still played.
Another pretty good player you had was on the offensive side of the ball, a decent tight end by the name of Jackie Smith. Now, my memories of Jackie Smith are one guy could never tackle him, so he usually ended up getting pushed out of bounds or take about 3 or 4 guys to bring him down. Was it that way in practice as well?
Yes, Jackie Smith was a good football player. He wasn't as big as the tight ends are today, but he was bigger than, the regular receivers, and he could block. He was a tenacious guy, and he could run. He had real good speed and tremendous hands and tremendous motivation. Jackie was, I can't say enough about the guy. He could have played wide receiver. He had good speed, good moves, and he worked hard at the game. No, I've always respected his ability to play, and I was very happy that I had him. I was happy that I had most of the guys. I inherited a pretty good team. The guy that I replaced, Wally Lim, was a pretty darn good football coach.
The thing I remember about Wally Lim is whenever he'd be interviewed and he'd show up on TV, his pauses between words would be, and that's what I remember about Wally Lim. But
no, Wally was a good football coach. I didn't know him personally.
Yeah. Well, you had some pretty good backfield with a young Johnny Rowland and Prentice Scott and Willis Crenshaw.
Yeah,
those are 3 pretty tough running backs, I think.
Oh yeah, John Rowland from the University of Missouri. I still think John Rowland. He coached for a number of years in the league. I still think John Rowland would have made a good head coach. John Rowland as a running back, I used to talk to him. He knew all the blocking on the running plays. He didn't know just his own assignment. He knew all the blocking, and he was a very intelligent young man. And I often thought that he was overlooked. I think he had head coaching potential.
Yeah, well, he came along at a time where you didn't have African American head coaches in the NFL.
Right, and that's a shame because a lot of good people were overlooked, and John was one of them.
Yeah.
Who was your biggest rival when you were coaching the Cardinals?
New York Giants. That was always a tough team for us.
Well,
what made them so tough?
They were always competitive. They had a good football team. Charlie Connerly was the quarterback, and Gifford and Alex Webster. Mojileski, I think his name was, a lineman.
Yeah.
They just had a good football team, and they knew how to win games. And they had a good Jim Lee Howell was a good coach.
And they had good ownership in the Mara family.
Oh, I think the Maras are, over the years, have been one of the finest ownerships in professional football, and I think that shows in the production of the team over the years. Over the years, the Giants have always been a threat, and I like Wellington Mara. I remember the year that we got the coaching job in professional football. I was scouting the Senior Bowl in Mobile, Alabama, for the Browns, and I spent Christmas Day with Wellington Mara and Ann Mara. They were down there covering the game for the Giants, and I'll never forget that. And I can remember when Don Kellett, who was the general manager of the Colts, he was down here covering the game also, and so we had a flight together coming part way back, and I said to him, "Have you they were looking for a coach at the time. I said, "Have you considered this guy Eubank?" Yeah, we were interested in him, but Paul Brown said he wasn't interested in being a head coach. And I said, "Well, that's not true." I said, "He's my father-in-law, and I know he's interested." So he said, "Give me his telephone number." So I gave him a telephone number, and they called him, and that's how it all started.
Really?
How
Small world.
How did you end up getting hired by George Allen?
George Allen was an assistant coach at the Bears, and he and I came up together. You know, I got to know George over the years, and we became very good friends. And then when he got the job with the Washington, and we had always talked as head coaches, we'd always talk together. And I used to always get so mad at him because he was on the West Coast, and I'd be ready to go to bed, and he'd call me. And he didn't bother him because he had 3 hours advantage at the time. And I got to know George over the years, and so when I was available, you know, he hired me, which I really appreciated because I learned a lot from George. George was a fine football coach, fine gentleman.
And you were part of the Washington Super Bowl team.
Yes.
What was that experience like?
Well, it was a very... I think we made a mistake. We got out there a day earlier than we should have. And we peaked the day earlier. And we had a tremendous practice late in the week, and I felt that we got there a day too early rather than come in at the official time. George always wanted to have an advantage, so he thought it would be an advantage if we got there a day early, and I don't think it worked out that way. I think we kind of lost the edge.
How could you lose the edge by getting there a day early? I never understood that.
Say again?
How could you lose your edge getting there early?
Well, we got there early, and all during the week, I think we peaked before we should have, because we were really at the end of the week we were really high, and I don't think we had the same peak that we should have had we gotten there, you know, when we should have. You know, people who are playing that Super Bowl have been around for years, and the coaches know generally, you know, what's the best thing. And George, in trying to be extra efficient, thought another day there would be an advantage. And I think it may have been, but it didn't work out that way because I felt that earlier in the week we really had peaked at practice, and then we just didn't get any higher. That's just my opinion, though.
Yeah. It must have been interesting to compare that week to the 58 championship game and see how in a fairly short time the league had advanced and grown.
Yeah, I think as coaches we try sometimes to do too much. For example, I don't think we need all those weeks of preparation in training camp. I mean, we go to training camp and within 2 weeks we play a game, a practice game, and we play usually 5 to 6 of them, and we're always ready. So, you know, we don't need that much time in most cases. And I think the way the schedule is worked out, that the way things are going now and the way things have is the right way of approaching it. and I don't, I don't think that we should increase the preseason, and I think everything is working out okay now. I think we play enough games in the regular season, so we just, it was a little different. It was different.
Yeah.
When you went to the Jets, you had Joe Namath as the quarterback. What was the difference between Joe Namath and a Johnny Unitas? It seemed like they were polar opposites, or is that just me?
Well, they were different kind of people. They were both fine quarterbacks. They could both throw the ball. They could both call plays. Joe Namath, I think, got a reputation from Sonny Werblin, who was the chief owner at that time, had been in show business, and they promoted stars differently than football players are promoted. And he tried to promote Joe to something that he wasn't. You know, a lot of times Joe would be out, and he might be having a ginger ale or something, and press would have him that they had to carry him out. And Joe wasn't that kind of a guy at all. Not that he did go out and have a good time, but he was one of the first guys there in the morning and one of the last guys to leave at night. And a very thoughtful individual. He had the bad knees, and no telling how good he would have been had they operated in college on his knees when they were supposed to, just like Mickey Mantle's knees. And after I got fired, people would come to Joe Namath because he's Joe Namath and say, "Now, Joe, have you heard about this treatment for arthritis and so forth?" And he would call my wife and say, "Mrs. Winter, have you heard about this?" and he didn't have to do anything like that, but he did it. And Joe is a very fine individual. John Unitas, great guy. Worked his tail off, and you never heard anything negative about John. But he didn't have the press build-up that Sonny Werblin built up with Joe Namath. Like Joe, they had him standing under the goalpost at a bowl game down in Alabama.
Yeah,
and Weed was the guy that signed him.
Well, if Namath had signed with the NFL team that had drafted him, you would have ended up coaching him with St. Louis.
Yeah, I may not have gotten to St. Louis.
That's true, too.
I may not have gotten there.
But I think Werblin understood that for New York, the Giants were so entrenched
yes.
for so many generations that he had to make some sort of splash.
Yeah.
To create Broadway Joe was part of that if he was going to be competitive. If Namath had gone to, let's say Pittsburgh or someplace that's more low key, he doesn't become Broadway Joe. Yep.
Well, that day Broadway Joe sure stuck with it. When I was with the Redskins, we played the New York Jets. And somebody in the press was asking, Billy Kilmer was our quarterback at the time, and he couldn't compare to Joe or to Sonny Jurgensen, who was supposed to be the number one guy, but he became our number one guy because he had a big heart. So before the Redskin game, the newspapers were asking him about it. He said, "Well, it's going to be a battle between Broadway Joe and Beltway Billy." And we beat him.
Did anybody throw an uglier pass than Billy Kilmer?
Pardon?
Did anybody throw an uglier pass than Billy Kilmer?
No. Hey, he drank so much, his face was red, and they called him Furnace Face. But when he got in the huddle, and he called the play, the guys had confidence in him. They knew that he was going to get the job done. When he was a rookie, I guess it was San Francisco, he's coming up the coast highway there. He had an accident, and they found him in a ditch with a bone sticking out of his leg. And they said he'll never play football again. You know, he played and he had a heck of a great career.
Yeah. He sure did.
So did you draft my former favorite player of all time with the Dolphins, Dan Marino?
Yes, Dan Marino.
Was that an easy decision?
Pardon?
Was that an easy decision to draft him?
No, because there were rumors about drugs and Marino. You know, somebody started a rumor to keep people away from him. And when it came, Chuck Connor was our personnel man at the time, and with the Dolphins. And when it came our turn, you know, you have 4 or 5 names up on the board that you're considering, and when it comes your turn, you got so many minutes to make up your mind. And Shula was hesitating about it, and Chuck Connor said, "We're taking Marino," and that was it. So Shula said, "Okay." And that's how we got Marino. I'm not saying that Don wouldn't have taken him anyway, but Chuck Connor stepped up right away because he had seen a lot of Marino.
What was your position on it?
I was the director of pro scouting. I had to watch all the pros that were released, and about 1 or 2 bring them in for a tryout and so forth, so that during the season, if anything happened, I have a whole list of replacements that we could get. Now they have like a taxi squad.
Right.
In all your years,
and they still do that. They still bring in players to try them out, guys that have been left over. But that was my chief job when I went there. Then I ended up being director of total personnel.
In all your years in the NFL, you've seen a lot of great players. Most of the people, in all your years in the NFL, you've seen a lot of great players. Most of the people Ellie and I have talked to, Hall of Famers, say Jim Brown was the best ever. Do you agree?
That's hard to say, you know. There's been so many fine football players. Jim Brown was one of the greatest, and I had a lot of respect for him. But there's been an awful lot of good ones. Just look at Sammy Ball and Sid Luckman and Bronco Nagurski. I mean, there's been a lot of them, and it's athletes in all sports have gotten better because of nutrition and training facilities and training methods that naturally some of these guys are going to perform better today. But to say that one guy was the greatest all time, I mean, golly, there's been so many football players over the years that if you were going to start a team, I don't know who you'd start with.
You've been in...
But Jim Brown was a great player. I remember he used to say that he visualized each play as it was called. He would go through that play on his mind, and he'd always visualize that he was going for a touchdown, not just for a few years. He was going for a touchdown, and that always impressed me.
Yeah. Now, I can remember Larry Wilson tackling Jim Brown, and for one guy to bring him down, I thought was maybe a major miracle because. Oh
yeah, well, you're a St. Louis fan. You remember Pat Fisher who played safety for us?
Sure.
Pat
Number
Fisher
37.
was a real big guy, but he had the knack that he could go up and wrap around Big Jim's legs and get him down.
Yeah. Of course, Brown might have dragged him for another 5 or 10 yards before he
probably did.
Now, you've coached in cities that have had fantastic food. Was there any city that you preferred over the other?
Well, there was one when I was with the Washington Redskins. There was so much enthusiasm there that when a team was introduced, it's the first time in my life, and I was in professional football for 37 years, that I would get chills up and down my back because the Redskins fans were so enthusiastic. And and the fans are good. Professional fans, I think, are great, but there was just something there that it just got me anyhow. Yeah. And I don't know whether other people feel that way or not, but there was so much enthusiasm that I got chills.
But as far as dining out, did you have one town? I mean, Baltimore crab cakes.
I love those Baltimore crab cakes. I rate the Baltimore press box in those days #1 because of the crab cakes. I have a reputation of eating, and a lot of people used to call me about. They were going to a certain town. What's your favorite restaurant? And there's a lot of good places to eat in this country.
Definitely.
And that's my problem is that I like everything. When my mom put something on the plate, to me that was the world's best. And everything, it doesn't take much to please me. So when I'm not really a good judge because I might like things that other people don't like.
Okay. What is the secret to a long, happy marriage?
3 words. Let's eat out. Ladies like to hear that.
I thought it was just 2 words. Yes, dear.
Yeah, well, that's part of it. I always knew who the head coach was, and I still do.
One last question. You've worked with some of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. You had Otto Graham, you had Johnny Unitas, you had Sonny Jurgensen, Joe Namath, Dan Marino.
Yes.
If you were to start a team, which quarterback?
Oh my God, boy, that is so tough. I think you could be successful with any one of those guys because they all had what it took. You could even go back and put Sammy Ball in there, and I didn't have him.
You're not that old, right?
Pardon?
You're not that old.
No. One of the Baltimore newspaper men was at training camp when Y.A. Tittle was a rookie with Baltimore. And they walked into the room, and Y.A. Tittle sitting there with his feet up on the desk and chair back. And the guy said, Y.A., what are you thinking about? And he said, I'm sitting here trying to think of something I can't do. He had confidence in himself.
And he was a pretty good quarterback, as it turned out.
He was. And he could play offense and defense and punt. Hey, and that's another thing you talked about Jackie Smith. A lot of people don't know that Jackie Smith was an excellent punter. Yeah. And he got hit one time on the thigh, and he got a calcium formation there that when he'd extend his leg to punt, it would hurt him, and that's why he stopped punting. But he was an excellent punter.